Welcome, everyone. My name is Hildy Teagan, and I'm the Director of the Center for International Business Education and Research here at the George Washington University, and working with our colleagues at the Washington International Trade Association and the School of International Affairs, Elliott School of International Affairs International Trade and Investment Policy Program. We'd like to welcome you for our discussion this evening with Dan Sullivan. I'm going to turn the podium over to in a moment to my colleague Mike Moore, who's going to introduce Dan. But we just had the wonderful discovery that Dan and I actually went to high school together, and we haven't seen each other since probably 1983. So I'm very, very eager to hear that what this new and improved Dan Sullivan has to say since our high school days. But we're very, very pleased to have all of you with us. We're a newly launched center. We started here in October with funding from the U.S. Department of Education. And our mandate is to encourage research and education as well as outreach programming around U.S. business competitiveness. And in particular, our center is organized under the theme of institutions and development. One of the work areas where we have activities and programming concerns international trade, investment, and labor issues in developing countries, and Mike Moore, wearing one of his many hats, is actually our faculty coordinator for that area. So we're very pleased to be able to welcome all of you here today and to participate in this, what we hope to be a very engaging discussion. Mike, thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Moore, and I did not go to high school with Dan Sullivan, but had the honor to work with him in an earlier stint of his in the government. It's my great pleasure to welcome Assistant Secretary of State Dan Sullivan to the George Washington University. Mr. Sullivan has a wide range of experience in both the private and public sector. After practicing law and clerking at the U.S. Court of Appeals in the 9th District, Mr. Sullivan served at the National Security Council, where he focused on international economic policy. He was then called to active duty as a major in the U.S. Marines and served as strategic advisor and special assistant to the commander of U.S. Central Command. He then returned to Washington, where he was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of State on June 6, 2006. Assistant Secretary Sullivan has an economics degree from Harvard University and a master's degree in JD from George Washington University. He also has a lovely wife and 3 darling daughters. And Dan Sullivan will be speaking tonight on building for the future, the long-term economic agenda. Please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Dan Sullivan.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Tildy, great to see you again since high school. Boy, what a great surprise. What I wanted to do tonight was go over a few things, try and stay somewhat brief, really look at going over what I think is kind of a missed story in the international economic development area, particularly with regard to President Bush's administration, and then talk to you briefly about kind of the way I see things from a kind of operational standpoint, how in terms of policy in some of these different areas, how we focus on them. And then, but what I really want to do is kind of get to the Q&A section tonight and have a good discussion. And one of the things for the students in the audience, if you're a student, I do this a fair amount, particularly overseas with, I always like to go out to universities when I'm traveling and talk and get a sense from the student body what's on their mind. So there's a kind of a tit for tat here. If you ask me a question, I'll take the question, but then I always kind of have the opportunity to do a follow-up with you, or at least ask you what you're going to do when you graduate from GW after getting great classes by Professor Mike Moore here. So that will be part of the dialogue tonight. I hope well, I look forward to it. And but what I first want to do, and again, I want to kind of keep this informal. I have some remarks written down, but nothing too formal. I wanted to go over what I see really in terms of. There's been a lot of discussion over the last several months now already. You have an administration 6 years into its 2 terms, and so of course discussions on legacy and place in history seem to come up a lot. One of the things that I think in my realm, in the international economics area, in the development area, in a number of different areas, I think that there's kind of a missed story on some of the legacy issues, and that is really where this administration is in terms of the record it has in several of these areas. I'm going to touch on 7, briefly hit on 8, kind of as a way going forward, and then, as I mentioned, talk briefly about kind of from the policy perspective how we see operationalizing a lot of this. But the 7 areas I wanted to touch on where I think the record of this administration is not only strong, but actually, you know, when the historians look back, will look back very, very favorably. Again, focus in these in the international economics and development area. The first, of course, which I know is near and dear to a lot of people's heart here, is in the trade area. And whether it's obtaining TPA, which used to be called Fast Track, which is very difficult to get. I think in 2002 we got that by 1 vote. President Clinton, although he tried very hard, I think was never able to achieve that. Launching the Doha negotiations, negotiating and completing and getting through Congress all kinds of FTAs. I think this administration has negotiated and completed more FTAs than all the rest of the presidential administrations combined. Right now we're at 13, and with more on the way, hopefully. Colombia, Peru, Panama was just recently signed. Still negotiating Korea, Malaysia. And then also in the area, and again, this is often overlooked, but in the trade preference area. So again, in 2002, we had the GSP program reauthorized, the Andean Trade Preference Program reauthorized, AGOA reauthorized, and again, these were just reauthorized this past fall as well. So in this area in particular, very, very strong record, and again, I think I can go into a lot of detail, but I want to hit kind of the wave top so we have a lot of room for discussion. The second area is an area that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's in terms of the development assistance area. And in particular, in 2002, when the President called for a new compact for global development, and this really is the Millennium Challenge account, which has been transformed into the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And for those of you who are familiar with this is really looking at development assistance in a way that I think has been very different from the way people have previously looked at it. In particular, there was a commitment on the side of the donor nations to significantly increase development assistance. And that's happened, I think, by threefold. The numbers here, again, our assistance in 2005 is almost at $28 billion in terms of development assistance, which is a 270% increase over year 2000 levels. But the key here is the 3 criteria with which the MCA program, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, focus on delivering development assistance, because it goes to countries that rule justly, invest in their people, and encourage economic freedom. And so in many ways, and I've seen it, and we can talk about this, I think these criteria, the approach in terms of development assistance, has really in a lot of ways revolutionized the way people think about development assistance. And I see this when I travel, I see this when I talk to other government officials, that you put responsibility on the countries that are actually receiving the aid in addition to the countries that are giving the aid. And this, and again, I can give some real-world examples where this I think is working very, very effectively. The third area I wanted to talk about, and it's related to the second area, but is in the President's commitment to fighting infectious diseases, pandemic diseases. This relates very closely to development, as I mentioned in the kind of the second area. But whether it's the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, PEPFAR as it's known, $15 billion over 5 years dedicated to fighting AIDS, or the malaria initiative. These are the President's Malaria Initiative, which announced in June 2005, devotes $1.2 billion in terms of over 5 years. these are very dramatic policy initiatives that have a moral component to it in terms of helping the people who need it the most from one of the countries that has the most in terms of opportunities to help. $15 billion, these are numbers, I think, and again, I don't have them in front of me, but the United States, in terms of PEPFAR, provides more AIDS relief than the rest of the world combined. So the numbers are dramatic, and the effect has been very dramatic. A fourth area, I'm sorry, you don't hear much about this at all, but for those of you who focus on development, who focus on promoting economic growth in the developing world, is in the area of anti-corruption. This is an area that, regardless of what the forum is, the G8, the Summit of the Americas, APEC, the United States, this administration has been very forceful in terms of promoting anti-corruption policies globally. We recently signed the UN Convention Against Corruption. The Senate ratified this, and this is an area where currently I'm doing a lot of work in the upcoming G8 meetings. Again, it's an area in the G8 where we have led promoting this, but not written about a lot, but has a dramatic effect in terms of creating the conditions that will lead to private sector economic-led growth in much of the developing world. And it's an area not only with this administration, but the United States in general has led for really the last several decades. A fifth area, again, you don't hear too much about this, but is in the arena of keeping the focusing on the freedom of expression, particularly with regard to the internet. There's a lot of work that is being done globally, but there's also about every year or so you get certain initiatives whereby certain international governmental bodies want to gain more control over what in terms of internet control, the ability to influence the internet. It's an area that we have worked very closely on to keep the internet free, to keep freedom of expression free, and it's something that, like I said, we've worked hard on. You don't read about it a lot, but it's something that is an area that we think is very important. A sixth area, and you do read about this a lot, is particularly in the post-September 11th world, is working to shut down terrorist finance. And that's an ongoing, difficult area, but extremely important, and it's an area in which there's been dramatic gains. And finally, the seventh area is what I would just say in terms of having a steady hand on the economy. Our economy has been through a lot, whether it's the September 11th attacks, corporate scandals, huge spikes in terms of oil and energy inputs, and yet the economic growth that we've had over the last several years has been very dramatic. And this relates directly, in my view, to a very sound, strong, deep, broad international economy that has really taken place over the last several years. In a recent op-ed piece, President Clinton's former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers noted, "The world economy in aggregate grew more during the past 5 years than in any 5-year period since the Second World War. Growth is not merely strong, it is widely shared. According to the World Bank, the economies of the high-income countries probably grew by 3.1%, with the U.S. achieving 3.2% growth, Japan 2.9% growth, and even the sluggish Eurozone 2.4% growth." And then he talks about the growth in the developing world, whether it's China, India. There's many other countries that have experienced very, very dramatic, sustained economic growth. And I believe this very strongly. Maybe I can ask one of the professors here, but without the United States is that consistent, strong engine of economic growth over the last several years, you would not have had the broad international economic growth that was achieved over the last 6 years. So these are 7 areas, I think, that demonstrate a record that is very positive, very substantial. There's 2 more years to go, at least with this administration. One of the things that we're looking at doing is to consolidate the success in a lot of these areas, and then to build on it, both in the areas that I talked about, the 7, but also looking at other areas. One area in particular that I'm interested in is in the energy security area. And there has been, as you can imagine, a strong interest in this, given the high oil prices, given where we get a lot of our energy, and the key to this really is diversity. Diversity of supply, diversity of sources, diversity of types of energy that we use, and I think that there's been a very strong move in terms of looking at ways in which to extend what we're doing domestically in the energy front. The President gave a pretty dramatic, laid out some pretty dramatic proposals during the State of the Union on the domestic front, but looking at ways in which to cooperate with our partners and friends overseas. We can talk about that if you'd like. I actually just got back from a 2-week trip in the Caspian region, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, that focused a lot on energy security, ways in which we can work with the other countries in that region, critical region, in terms of energy, to broaden and diversify energy sources, whether it's natural gas, oil, and then looking at all kinds of cooperation that we're doing, ongoing cooperation with the EU, many other countries in terms of energy efficiency and technology work that we're doing in terms of our both domestically and internationally. So those are some areas I wanted you to think about that I've kind of said are a missed story. I think that this record, from an international economic and development standpoint, is extremely strong. A lot more work to do, but it's been a very positive 6 years. Now, a final point I wanted to just talk about briefly is in terms of operationalizing some of these, how we focus on these in terms of from a policymaker standpoint. My bureau at the State Department is a relatively large bureau. It's a functional bureau, so it focuses on different economic issues. I have a deputate that focuses on energy issues and sanctions, one that focuses on trade and investment, one that focuses on international finance issues, debt relief issues, one that focuses on communications and information technology, and one that focuses on business advocacy. So really across the board we have different groups in terms of across different economic disciplines, and one that focuses on transportation, civil and maritime transportation. So my boss, Secretary Rice, has set out a vision for what she refers to as transformational diplomacy, and that is looking at diplomacy in a way in which it operationalizes it, where you have diplomats in the field in different countries, not just reporting, but actually working to move forward the economic, political, security interests of the United States. One of the ways in which we are focused on that, kind of in the economic realm, as I mentioned, is to look across a broad cross-section of economic issues. And when we look at a country, a lot of times you'll hear, okay, Central America, we have the recently passed CAFTA, Central America Free Trade Agreement. When we look at that, though, we want to look at all these different programs and see how they fit together. So, for example, I will be going to Central America actually next week. And the focus is going to be not only on CAFTA, but what we're doing in terms of, we have Millennium Challenge account programs in almost every one of these countries that focus on the elements of helping the trade. So whether it's on road networks or increased technical assistance in terms of schools, what they're teaching. So you look at the different elements of our economic toolkit, really, and look at ways in which to integrate these and think through all of the different disciplines as really the way to move forward in terms of our, what we call total economic engagement. So where are the missing pieces in terms of our engagement with Central America or Central Asia or a country like Colombia? Looking across the economic disciplines is a way in which we believe is the most effective way to enhance economic growth in these regions and move forward on our broad economic relationship with several of these countries. So these are just some thoughts, really food for thought for you, and I look forward to our discussion. And again, Mike, Tildy, the rest of the faculty and students here, I want to thank you very much for inviting me, and look forward to our discussion. So thanks.
So I need to get on the record that I gave Dan an honorary master's and JD degree from George Washington University in the introduction. I have great faith in Dan's judgment. He actually got those degrees from Georgetown University. I thought that he would want to be with the guy who won the Revolutionary War rather than the guy who lost it. But in any event, I wanted to set the record straight on that. So let me open this up to questions from the audience. And so, please, ma'am.
Barbara Bowie was formerly at State working on trade policy. And
Formerly where? I'm sorry.
Formerly at State.
Oh, great.
I was trade policy
Were you
coordinator.
in EB?
No, I was in Western Hemisphere. I worked as trade policy coordinator for Western Hemisphere for 4
Great.
years. Just ended that assignment. And I'd like to ask about your view of the prospects of getting those 3 agreements in the Western Hemisphere through the Congress before TPA expires.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, my view on that has always been that the headlines that came out of the recent elections with regard to the ability to move forward the administration's trade agenda was I thought was very overplayed in terms of, I mean, everybody here saw them, that essentially it made the point that with the change in the party in charge of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, that the trade agenda in terms of getting these FTAs or TPA extended was going to be very difficult. I think that now that people have been meeting, that the administration has been meeting with members of Congress, that it isn't nearly as dire as the press had initially made it out to be. I think there's going to be a lot of difficult work, but getting trade agreements over the goal line has always been difficult. I think, as I mentioned at the outset, TPA was passed by 1 vote in 2002.
Yeah,
And
passed by 2.
what's that?
CAFTA was passed
And
by
CAFTA was passed by 2. And so, but I think when you look at a lot of these agreements, Colombia is a great example. It is strongly in the national interest, the foreign policy interest, the trade interests of the United States to have a U.S.-Colombia free trade agreement. And I think members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are recognizing that and will begin to recognize it. So I think that there's a lot of hard work to do, but I'm hoping that the record will continue to be unblemished. I don't think Congress has ever voted down any free trade agreement ever. So let's hope we can continue that good, important winning streak.
Yes, sir.
In terms of, you talked a little bit about energy security. Given that Brazil is about 30 years ahead of us in the ethanol production industry, do you see increased economic ties with Brazil?
I think the answer is probably yes. I think there's been a lot of discussions between our government and the government of Brazil in terms of looking at areas for cooperation in this area, and a lot of opportunity there. And so I think the answer is yes, that there is a lot of potential there.
Yes.
Wait, I haven't even asked any follow-up questions, but I guess, okay, you'll get my first one.
I'm Edgar Scars with the Center for International Trade and Security. Given Fidel Castro's poor health, I'm sure that the current administration is developing or has developed a post-Castro plan of engagement with Cuba. Given my Cuban heritage, I'm just interested to know what the economic approach will be towards Cuba after he dies. Will the embargo be lifted or not?
Yeah, I think on that issue right now, I think we're focusing on the, we've been focusing primarily on the here and now, with the embargo obviously staying in place. In terms of what would happen if and when Fidel Castro dies, I don't want to speculate on that right now.
Yes.
I'm Brian Gist with the Business School here.
Okay, Brian.
My question is regarding the anti-corruption program. I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight into some of the objectives that they're hoping to achieve, whether it's obviously the African countries have a lot of corruption, but as do the Central Asian republics, and even some question about South America. What type of agenda do we have, and what type of toolbox do we have to try to make those come
No,
around?
it's a great question.
Excuse me, did you hear that in the back? Okay, excuse me.
Well, I think it's a really good question, and it's actually something that we've been working on. I mean, the idea that you mentioned, this toolbox idea. But if you look across and this is why I think this is an area that I'm again, I don't think it's one that gets a lot of prominence. But even if you look in our FTAs, there's transparency provisions. There is anti-corruption provisions. I mean, the anti-corruption agenda of this administration is very, very broad, right? I think one of the key elements, though, is to just there's an educational component to this. And I was in Norway, and I gave a speech at the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I don't know if anyone here has heard of this. This is EITI. It was an initiative launched, actually it was a UK idea. It was launched at the G8 several years ago that we've been very strongly supporting. But there's been and what was interesting to me is that in the corruption area, it's one area that you're starting to see this coming together of different groups who are finally focused on how this is such a problem in certain areas of the world. In some areas, I think probably the most critical economic development problem. But B, a recognition both in these countries, but importantly in the developed world as well, on how debilitating this can be. And the reason I mentioned earlier that it's been not only this administration but U.S. leadership, we were the first to, with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the late 70s, to criminalize giving bribes. Well, you had European countries that were still deducting for tax purposes the bribes that their businessmen were giving even into the mid and late 1990s. So there's been a very dramatic sea change in terms of what people think about corruption. And I think trying to highlight it, trying to educate both our public, the public in terms of in the developing world has been critical. And again, I mentioned this, that I went off and gave this speech at this conference, at the EITI conference in Norway. And what was really striking to me was, before I left, I wanted to kind of get a group of the stakeholders who are interested in this issue. And it was fascinating because it was some of the major energy companies and their representatives, some of the major NGOs, Transparency International and other NGOs. And we were all in the room, and I said, okay, I'm going to be going to this conference. You know, what do you think the goal should be? And it was very unusual because you don't typically have this broad cross-section of groups, very broad. I mean, I'm just only hitting on a few of who was there, that agree on this issue, on what a critically important issue it is. And so I think you're really starting to see momentum in this area. And I think you see in, it's also a tool that I think from a foreign policy perspective that is also very important. You look at some of the regimes in which we have problems with right now, whether it's Venezuela, Iran. Corruption is a huge issue in these places. And I think that the more we're identified with anti-corruption policies, the more we will be closely identified by the populations in these countries as supporting their aspirations. So, but to answer your question more specifically, I think that we've looked at a broad number of anti-corruption tools. The G8 announced last year in St. Petersburg another anti-corruption initiative that focused on kleptocracy, so kind of very high-level theft by very senior government officials, huge thefts of money. And the United States, we implemented that with a kleptocracy initiative that brings together the Treasury Department, the Department of Justice, the State Department, in a coordinated fashion to deny visas to entry from those kind of thieves, really, to try and recover the assets and to work at bringing some of these people to justice. So this is just one small example of the broad kind of toolbox. But as I mentioned, we've been very active from a multilateral standpoint, whether it's some of the Americas, APEC, G8, in pressing for initiatives that really try and multilateralize the approach on corruption. But I think it's an area that you're going to hear more about. Thanks.
Program. You highlighted a number of areas in which the Bush administration, you highlighted a number of areas where the Bush administration believes it's had a favorable record in helping international economic development. I was wondering in the next few years to come what the administration sees as the biggest challenges in promoting economic development globally.
Okay, that's a great question. I think in terms of challenges, there is really one of the key challenges, I think, is really looking at ways in which to incorporate the rise of some of the big growing economic powers, whether it's, and in particular, I think China looms large in that regard. The former Deputy Secretary of State, Bob Zoellick, gave a speech that I think a lot of people have focused on in terms of the strategic way in which we are looking at China, and that's to encourage China to become a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Some of the areas that I've been working on is working with China to become a responsible stakeholder in the area of international economics, and to work in a way that they have benefited dramatically from the international economic system that the United States has really focused over the last several decades on overseeing. And to encourage them as they rise, as they continue to grow, to to play by the rules, whether it's intellectual property. We just filed a WTO case with regard to Chinese subsidies in some of their industries. So to play by the rules, but in a lot of ways this is in their own self-interest, because otherwise you get a very large backlash in terms of their economic growth, in terms of what they're doing economically, not only in the United States but globally. So I think that is that I would say is one of the largest challenges that is on the horizon right now in terms of really incorporating the large economic growth of China into the global economic system.
My name is John Thompson. I'm in Professor Moore's trade class. And I'm curious what you might tell a member of Congress when voting on a particular FTA, if he or she is concerned about domestic agricultural effects of an FTA on the viability of the industry here in the United States.
You mean if the impact of the FTA would possibly hurt constituents in the...
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'm maybe making this question harder on myself than I need to.
No,
what would I mention to a... Well, I think that's a good question. I think the general answer would be in all free trade agreements, and Professor Moore knows this better than I do, but those who are going to be harmed or potentially could be harmed if you do statistics or studies or show where the competitive industries that might be affected. It's a huge. I mean, it's a big concern, right? I mean, it has to be a concern. It has to be a concern of any government. But that's usually very localized. It's usually something that you can focus on, and it's something that looks tangible, whether it's the loss of a factory or something. The benefits, though, are much more widely spread, and I think, and a lot of times they're not always so easy to quantify or to actually envision. But nevertheless, they're still a hugely important component of why we believe in an open trading system. And so I think in terms of focusing on that cost-benefit analysis, almost always you'll find that the benefits outweigh the costs, but the costs are very tangible and real. They seem very real. And so I think to think through that analysis is very important, but it is, I think, also important from a government standpoint, whether it's with Congress or the administration, is to work to help those who are affected by free trade in our country through job retraining, through the TAA assistance. I mean, that's a very important part of kind of the overall commitment to free trade. You have to maintain the public support, the congressional support, by acknowledging that there is pain associated with these agreements, and then by trying to address it. But because there is pain, you also shouldn't shut down the idea of an open trading regime, open trading system, because again, you're going to do more damage to the economy, into the U.S. population than you would to help it. So now let me ask you, now that you've gotten all this wisdom from Professor Moore, what are you going to do with it when you graduate?
Well, I don't know that yet. That's I can figure out the specifics in the next few months, but maybe something along those lines.
He's still waiting for some wisdom to
right.
come his way.
Or a good grade from you, right?
Michael Finger, hard question. Assuming that eventually the war part of Iraq is over, what's the thinking about how we're going to get Iraq back into the international economy? And broader than that, is there any thinking about how to broaden the interface of the Middle East into the international economy more than exporters of oil and et cetera. So what's the thinking there about how to, the old post-World War II interface, if we trade more, we fight less. How are we going to get that to work in the Middle East?
Well, I think I'll try and answer both. I mean, what you mentioned in terms of the premise of the question, I think in terms of the security situation in Iraq, already there's a lot of work going on the economic side. And again, it's not one of these things that you read about a lot, but one of the areas that I've been very focused on. The Secretary, in some of her recent testimony, has highlighted it. It's the international compact, the Iraq International Compact, and what we've been working with, really the Iraqi government, but the world. Been the World Bank and the UN. Really, the World Bank, the UN, the Iraqi government have been the lead on this, which has been a very important component of this. But it's looking at ways in which the Iraqi government commits to substantial economic reforms, and we've worked with them on this document, their commitments, which really are some of the most dramatic economic reforms anywhere in the Middle East, in exchange, not in exchange, but in cooperation with the international community in terms of the different, whether it's additional assistance, whether it's additional debt relief, whether it's the international community stepping up in a way to assist them as part of this compact. So it's been something we've been working on for months now, and the compact itself is very far along. It hasn't really been launched in an official conference yet, but it's an area that we think will have significant benefits for the economy there, which is critical. I spent, as Mike said, I spent a fair amount of time over there the last year and a half, and the potential in terms of non-energy sector economic activity is very striking, whether it's the entrepreneurial spirit of the people, whether it's the agriculture sector. A lot of this has been really ruined by the 30 years of Saddam rule that is kind of a lot of the sectors of the economy are in such bad shape, whether they're terribly subsidized but there's a lot of area that we think has potential, and so one of the things that the International Compact does is look at areas in terms of specific, kind of on the macro side, economic reforms that will be important to start implementing soon. I mean, I think the one thing, at least in my experience over there, was that you have a lot of time and discussion of, well, we got to get the security right so we can get the economic situation correct. And I think really it's a much more complex relationship. If you work on getting the economic situation correct, that will obviously help with the security and vice versa. So it's a little bit more complex than that. And so it's an area that we've been very focused on. Again, doesn't make a lot of headlines, but I think there's been decent progress on that. On the broader question with regard to the Middle East, in 2003, the President launched this initiative for the Middle East Free Trade area, the MEFTA, and we've actually made a lot of progress on that in terms of the different free trade agreements that we have enacted with several countries in the Middle East. But what's critical to that is that this initiative looks at our engagement there in an incremental way. So obviously the big goal would be a free trade agreement with the United States, and at some point, I think the goal laid out by the President was 2013 to have a full free trade area there, stitch together these different free trade agreements. But in the interim time, you look at where a country is in terms of its integration with the global economy, and you work on that. So if a country is not a member of the WTO, well, that's one of the first areas that you should focus on. And so we've been focusing on that. If a country is, you look at possibly the next step, at least bilaterally with the United States, which we call a trade and investment Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, TIFAs, where you look at ways in which to discuss basic trade and investment opportunities and challenges. And I think I don't know the number now, but we have negotiated and completed a very large number of these TIFA agreements that are having effect. It's a long-term prospect. It's a critical question that you rightly put your finger on, but we've been fairly focused on it and have made steady progress. None of these negotiations are easy, but there's been progress on that front as well.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. Has anybody been raising their hand for a long time that I haven't had a chance to? Okay, well, I guess you look honest, so I'll.
It sort of follows on the question on agriculture, and I'm interested in trade as a development tool, and looking at opportunities for least developed countries, looking at opportunities for African countries, and really where they can compete in the world is at the commodity level. But in the U.S., for instance, we have a lot of, we may allow duty-free access into the United States, but you have quotas that may limit, and so an LDC won't export to the U.S. market. African countries don't invest into their infrastructure or into those areas where they can compete because we have essentially closed markets. Right? Sugar is one example. How do you see going forward within Doha or within AGOA or within other preference programs the opportunities for trade as a development tool and really in these areas where they can compete, like sugar and value-added products, and how do you foresee that?
Well, I think no, it's a great question. I think it's a critical development question because, as you probably know, in a lot of these economies, the ag sector makes up such a huge proportion of the employment picture. I think 70% is not an unusual number in a lot of the LDC economies and developing economies in Africa in terms of employment. So I think my view is the key is the Doha negotiations, because part of the problem is that we have large agriculture subsidies, and but it's difficult to look at ways in which we would even conceive of reducing those unless it was in a global context. So that's been our view, but we've been very, very forward-leaning in terms of the proposals. The president at the UN in 2005, set forth the challenge that we would eliminate our ag subsidies if other countries would. I mean, this is a UN speech by the President of the United States. It's not something to be taken lightly. So I think that the key issue is the Doha negotiations in terms of enabling these countries, particularly the least developed economies, to begin to compete in some of these areas, in some of these commodity areas. And I think what's also important in that regard is the change in terms of some of the countries themselves, what they see that's in their interest. I was at Cancun when the Doha round kind of had its first major hiccup, and I'll never forget. I walked right when they announced that the negotiations had been suspended and everybody was going to go home early. There was a group of LDC officials from certain countries with some NGOs, and they all cheered that great, the Doha negotiations had broken out. And I remember just looking, going, I can't believe these guys are cheering. Well, the countries, I mean, if the countries that in some ways need this the most, a global development round, focused on some of the issues that you talked about, are cheering the demise of it. I just didn't, and I don't think you would see that cheering now. I think there's been a strong recognition globally, particularly in the developing world, that this hopefully will be a good deal and a very critical deal for these countries to grow, as you mentioned, economically, to develop their economies develop some of their sectors in which they're competitive. So I think that's the key. So
I think we're done.
okay.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the Elliott School, I want to thank James Wilkinson from the Washington International Trade Association, Hildy Teagan from the GW-CIBER for having Dan Sullivan here. Enjoyed it very much, and please join me in giving him a round of applause.
Good to see you.
We have a reception following, which I don't know exactly where it is, but I guess down the hall. So.